Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Cyber Pulse podcast. So, today's episode is about negotiations. When people hear the word ransomware, they often picture one moment, a ransom note, a deadline, and a demand for money. What we don't talk about enough is what happens after that moment. Ransomware negotiations are not just about payment, they involve pressure, uncertainty, legal limits, business impact, and people trying to make the least damaging decision in a very short amount of time. Therefore, in today's episode, we're focusing on what ransomware negotiations are actually all about, how they start, how they unfold, and what organizations are really dealing with behind the scenes. I have two amazing guests with me, uh, Predrag and Hadi. I believe you met Hadi before from one of my other episodes, and I also have Peter. His real name is Predrag, but he wants me to call him Peter because it's easier for us to pronounce. So, before we get into the details of today's episode, can you both please introduce yourselves to the audience and tell me more about yourself?
All right. My name is Predrag, but you can easily call me Peter. It's easier for a lot of people, right? I'm basically in cybersecurity for approximately 20 years, more or less. I've been in different positions from secure coding, software development, attack simulations, and breach simulations and stuff like that, right? So both sides, blue team, red team, purple teaming, and yeah, quite interesting background. Also, I was part of Palo Alto Networks Unit 42 as part of the incident response team as a director. And currently, I work as a senior solutions architect in Microsoft. So that's briefly about me. But let's carry on with the topic for the day.
Nice, mashallah. That's a really nice, interesting, brief introduction. So, Hadi, please do introduce yourself to the audience again, just for them to remember who you are.
Well, I'm Hadi Sleiman, computer science student, and I do a lot of cybersecurity research and AI solution, and I try to merge both together. So yeah.
Okay, so Predrag, Peter. Sorry, I have this tendency of sticking to real names, so forgive me. I don't mean to be rude when I do that.
Yeah.
So Peter, I have a question for you. When people hear ransomware negotiation, what do they usually misunderstand about it?
Well, I'm not going to talk about misunderstanding, right? But primarily, when we do talk about ransomware negotiations, people need to be aware of a couple of things, right? So the first one is that the attacker always has the upper hand, which means that they encrypted your data, they exfiltrated your data, and they're threatening with the release of the data, right? So this is the first aspect that every organization needs to understand and every cybersecurity professional that's facing this situation. So that premise needs to be very clearly communicated to everyone that's actually involved in a ransomware incident, right? So you start with that assumption. So usually people do believe that this is something that can be negotiated easily, that it's always going to result in people deleting your data or providing you the decryption key or any information that you need post ransomware payment, right? So the expectations always have to be clear to the customer or to the affected entity that ransomware negotiations may not resolve in a favorable outcome. And this is basically just a risk that you're engaging in with the threat actor.
Interesting. That's a nice way to put it because a lot of people make assumptions that this is just a very easy, smooth process. Like they compare real life scenarios to what they actually see within the movies. And that's what I want to paint here, that real scenarios is very different from what we see or witness within movies.
Correct. Right. So there are a lot of contributing factors to the outcome of the ransomware negotiations, right? So it's not as simple as Liam Neeson movie where he is talking to the kidnapper on the other side, right, and threatening him. This is a complete opposite scenario, right?
Because I think
So
in real life scenarios, you can't choose a side. Your job is to just negotiate, but you can't really choose a side. It's just you're trying to provide a reference in terms of what's happening. Correct me if I'm wrong.
you have like decent understanding of it, right? So usually customers do engage in ransomware negotiations for multiple different reasons, right? First reason is probably to get their data back if they can or if they want to. Second is basically to stall the release of the documents that they're threatening to leak, and also to have a proof of life, what we call it, right? Basically to validate that the threat actor actually has your data, right? So that they're threatening to release. So you have multiple aspects on where the customer engages a ransomware, let's say, how do you call them, a negotiation, right? So they involve you maybe to recover the key, provide them with the decryption key, provide them with basically remediation strategy, eradicate the threat actor, and many other things, determine the initial point of entry, did the threat actor leave any backdoors or anything else, right? So primarily, first thing is first, you need to establish the decryption keys will work, right? So the threat actor will provide you with decrypted files. You will ask for proof of files and listing what the threat actor has exfiltrated, ask maybe for a couple of files from that particular playbook, and so on and so forth, right? So there are a lot of different aspects in
How
ransomware
can you
negotiations.
negotiate with the hacker though? Like, is there even a way to talk with the hacker to negotiate maybe the price to decrypt, or because I don't think they would even, like, from what I've seen, there is no way to communicate with the hacker. They just give you their address for like a Bitcoin or whatever type of like cryptographic currency, and you just send them and you hope they pay you back. But is there actually a way to communicate with the hacker? I mean, would the hackers even allow that?
So let's not call them hackers, let's call them threat actors.
Okay, sure.
On another aspect, right? So usually when a ransomware incident happens in an organization, right, they leave you a ransom note. And usually they will drop you a
Address.
link, correct. They will not leave you the Bitcoin address and tell you pay me here to get. They would establish a communication channel, right? So usually these ransomware operators, they host infrastructure, right? Which means that you will connect to the Tor network, open their requested URL where they told you to log in. They provide you with the details how to access it, and this is where the communication starts, right?
Okay.
Hopefully,
And
this makes a little bit of sense.
But that opens a way to track them on the dark web, because there are some companies that actually do dark web tracking, especially for the Tor network. Maybe this way you can, if the company is huge, they would pay a lot for people to actually track them. Maybe that would solve the problem. Because these hackers, the way they got files of this company, they would probably do it to another company, you know? What do you think of that?
That's not the main thing, right? So again, the threat actors primarily use infrastructure that's very difficult to reveal its origin, right? So there are cases where law enforcement actually takes over a ransomware operator infrastructure, and this has happened in the past, right?
Yes.
So these things do happen. They do have a risk of being even attacked by law enforcement agencies and basically taken down. This has happened in the past, and sometimes it's effective, sometimes it bounces back, right, to the actual victims. So,
from my perspective, I feel like when a group or when an APT group reaches that level, their main goal would be the finance, the money behind it. Anything else is completely irrelevant to them. They're not thinking that way. They're thinking, how can we secure this the best way possible and just move on with our lives? So, Peter, I have a question for you. At what point does a situation turn into a negotiation rather than just an incident response problem?
Alrighty. So usually when a victim calls a ransomware negotiator or incident response company, they assess the situation, right? So first thing is first, they determine which ransomware variant it is. So which ransomware family this encryption belongs to, like you have different like Lockbit and so on and so forth. So a lot of these, let's say, ransomware operators or ransomware families, basically they leave you with the information that allows you to communicate back to the threat actor, right? So the moment you establish that data is basically encrypted, you cannot recover the data, basically your backups are corrupted, this is when basically the organization has to accept the fact that somebody needs to negotiate with the threat actor. Right. And at this stage, you will start negotiating, right? So you will ask for basic things like proof of decryption keys. So you will provide encrypted files. They will decrypt it for you. You will ask probably for lowering the ransom amount, so on and so forth, right? So there are different things that are happening during this process. So usually it's the organization that is attacked that has the right, or I mean, they're the only ones who have the right basically to tell you, yes, we want to negotiate now with the threat actor on getting the decryption key. And usually this happens on two things, right? One is that the data is gone, encrypted, their backups are gone, and basically they cannot recover their data. And this is when they start negotiating around receiving the decryption keys to basically gain access to their data. And the second aspect when they start negotiating is that in case the threat actor has exfiltrated sensitive information that can damage the reputation, and the organization is going to suffer reputational loss, lawsuits, and everything else, this is when they engage with the threat actor to prevent release of the data. Because usually ransomware operators tend to do extortion in different ways. One is threatening to release the files, right?
Yes.
The second one is they basically are going to tell you, we're going to knock on all of your customers and tell them data is breached, and then basically start telling you that you need to pay, right? And then they will contact your suppliers telling them that you're breached, hence creating more and more pressure on you as a victim, right?
They'll threaten you in different ways for the main purpose, which is the money, but they all have different styles of doing this. It depends on how serious it is, let's say. So I have a question, like I'm curious when it comes to this. When it comes to the negotiation part, who usually makes the decisions? Like, is it the entity itself? Is it police operations? Is it the negotiator? Who's involved behind this process?
So ultimately, the customer or the victim has the last say, right? So they're the ones who tell you this is what we got, right? So as an example, when you do connect to the operator's infrastructure, when you provide the credentials and log in to the portal for communication, they will tell you what is the expected amount, right? So then there are a couple of things that will happen at this point, right? One, that amount is determined by the threat actor based on the, let's say, either customer or value of the data. But there are scenarios where the threat actor, for example, once they have exfiltrated the information and they find that you have cyber insurance and they read the information about how much you're insured, they will just put that amount into the actual ransom note, right? So they will tell you basically, we want X amount of Bitcoins and we will not negotiate because you have cyber insurance policy.
So they'll be aware of such policies and procedures, then they will determine the amount.
There were cases, definitely. So if the threat actor who is basically deploying the ransomware is aware of how much is your cyber insurance policy, then they will not negotiate, they will just tell you. But in case you are a company that doesn't have insurance, you have options to negotiate, right? And sometimes the negotiations can result in 10%, 20, 50, 70% of the original price, right? But it all depends on how well you are talking to the threat actor. Are you making them nervous? Are you delaying? So there are a lot of different things to factor in, right? So, for example, if a ransomware incident occurs in, let's say, for an example, in US, and you're doing the negotiations, right? You should be replying in US working hours. Nobody's going to expect you to reply from a time zone in China, as an example, right?
Yes.
So there are a lot of things that you need to follow to make it look authentic, to make it look realistic, right?
And how do you think AI tools are helping threat actors to make smarter and faster threats during negotiations?
So I haven't faced anything around AI in this case, right? So it's been quite some time since I was involved in this type of things, but I can only read about it at this stage. But where AI is helping a lot with the threat actors is primarily around automation, translation of the language if they're not fluent in the language, so on and so forth, right? So These are the initial things. But from a threat actor perspective, AI does help you in other aspects, right? Like if you're using AI agents, right, for example, and you're using AI to basically discover the fastest path to the keys of the kingdom, like Active Directory passwords and so on and so forth, right? So there are examples where AI is used, but to be frank and honest with you, I haven't experienced that myself, so I cannot talk about it.
Yeah. Do you think in the future negotiations will be with AI agents instead of the real threat actors?
I'm not sure even like who is behind the key, right? The moment you are negotiating, are you talking to the ransomware operator, aka the owner of the ransomware family, or you're talking to the threat actor leasing the infrastructure of the ransomware operator, right? So basically, we do know that they have affiliates that they can, they rent out their infrastructure to attackers, and they're using their, malware to deploy and their infrastructure to negotiate and communicate with the clients. So in most times, you don't know who's on the opposite side. The only thing you know is that the other person is a threat actor, right? Basically, maybe even a negotiator from the threat actor perspective. So it can be a bot, it can be a person, it can be somebody else, right? Like not the threat actor itself, it can be the ransomware operator or anybody. So this is something what we don't know.
Interesting. Peter, let me ask you this. How do legal, regulatory, or insurance considerations affect the negotiation process?
So primarily, what can stop the ransom to be paid are multiple things, right? So first aspect is the price of the threat actor, what they're requesting, right? So if they're requesting a higher price than the company executives are willing to pay, then basically this stops the negotiations and you're just waiting for the data to be released or whatever were the threats of the ransomware operator, they will materialize, right? So first thing is the price itself. Is it acceptable for the organization to pay that amount? The second thing that can affect the outcome of the negotiations, right, is the actual legal or regulatory compliance, right? So if you're not allowed to pay ransomware threat actors, right, whether they are sanctioned country or a sanctioned entity, right, or it's just prohibited in the country, like in some countries, then you're not allowed to do the payment. So there are different that are basically impacting from a legal perspective, from a financial perspective, and different teams do weigh in, right? So the CISO might be requesting the input from a legal counsel or from his legal team. They might be getting information from their insurance provider, whether this can be paid or not. They will get from the CEO or CFO. So there are different teams involved in the actual process when it comes to the decision whether the ransom will be paid or not. So this is from the client side.
Yes.
Now, the other side is from the ransomware operator, right?
Yeah.
So at a point, if you use the wrong language, if you're becoming too pushy on the other side, right? So if you as a negotiator are doing something to instigate the threat actor to basically just say negotiations over, we are releasing the data, this can happen as well, right? So there are two aspects that can actually break the negotiation process, right?
So in other words, like if they don't meet the deadline or certain requirements that the APT group wants, the APT group might be pressured to threaten them in a more harmful way. That's happened before, right?
They start to disturb some services sometimes from the company.
No, so basically, what can happen, right? So if you, and I just want to correct you, Sheikha, like I don't like to call APT groups for ransomware negotiations, like, you're not negotiating with APTs, you're primarily negotiating with, again, non-advanced threat actors, right? So these entities do gain access in your infrastructure in different ways, right? So this is why I don't like to call them APTs. Primarily, ransomware operators or these threat actors that do encrypt your infrastructure, right, and your data, they tend to access in the most easiest ways. It's either like brute forcing your account, finding your way to compromise credentials, or exposed services, right? Like vulnerabilities on services such as VPN devices from different vendors that have vulnerabilities, or your public facing services such as web servers or applications, right? So these are most likely used
Yeah.
as a common entry point for them, right?
Yeah, but from my experience, or let's say from my level of work, it's
Yeah.
usually the least expected way or the least unwatched way. That's going to be utilized the most for them to gain entry. This is how I see it.
It all depends on your security operations, right? So if you tend to ignore the brute force attacks or suspicious logon locations and things like that, like they will get in easily. I mean, they do get in through to compromised services or public facing services where basic hygiene is not done or and things like that. But ransomware operators don't tend to have access to zero-day exploits, right?
True.
They do have techniques to bypass EDRs, but these are not 0 days. They're primarily, like unhooking the EDR or just using some risky APIs to do some injection and privilege escalation, right? This is something I would not associate with APT groups and ransomware, right? That's the only thing I'm trying to say. But anyway, going back to your original question. Usually when you do get ransomware, the moment you open the link, right, that link that's provided by the operator, the countdown starts.
Yes.
So they will tell you from this moment on, you have 20 days to do the payment, as an example, right? So this is the countdown that you need to be aware of. And this countdown can be shifted. Like there are different transfer negotiation tactics where you're trying to stall, where you're trying to say like, I need to go back to the financial people to get, get some information back or do the confirmation. I'm just the IT guy. Like you're negotiating your way through it, right? As you always do. So how realistic the deadlines are, they're very, like organizations do get pressured by that time to basically either pay the data or they just abort the negotiations and face the consequences of not paying the ransom, right?
Okay.
The consequences can be either data is released, the sensitive data is released, or you don't get access to your keys, so on and so forth, right?
So from your perspective, Peter, what kind of internal pressure do leadership and response teams face during a situation like this?
That's a very interesting question. And it's different between different entities, right? Or different organizations. Sometimes if the impact is small, right? So it all depends on the blast radius of the actual ransomware itself. So if you have completely disrupted the operations of a entity, then the pressure is huge on the operations of the company to restore basic functionalities or their actual core business, right? So you need to look at it from two perspectives. You're coming at the worst time for an organization to help them negotiate or understand what is happening in their environment, right? So the pressure for the different teams is very, very different, right? So it's huge on the operating people, but it might not be for other departments, right? So, but primarily the business is suffering with not being able to do their operations, do their day-to-day business. Therefore, the pressure would be high in these entities if you're disrupting the whole organization. If you're just disrupting, like a small unit or a small subset of systems, then the pressure is not that big. Hopefully this makes sense a little bit.
I noticed something over the years happening, like with average ransom payments dropping a lot, sometimes by 35 or more year over year. What does this mean for how threat actors are, changing their plans?
I don't know what is the driver for the threat actors providing the price, right? So as I said, like sometimes if they do discover that you have cyber insurance, then their ransom demand will be that amount. So if the amount is growing, that means that the threat actors are, getting paid. The negotiations are being done by the organizations. How much do they lower from the original price? Nobody knows, right? So I've been in negotiations where they start with 10 million and you bring them down to 2 million. I've been in negotiations where they start with 5 million and you bring them down to 300,000, right? So That number is just telling you a statistical average from which data was collected and who actually announced the breach, right? Or was the actual real information provided. So I cannot tell you like on the industry average, what is the payment. I'm not doing the studies, right? But if it's going up, maybe the threat actors are demanding more money. If it's going down, they're demanding less amount of money, or they're just settling for a lesser amount of money that they requested, right? So they can see that the entity can pay that amount of money. If the entity is a small entity, they cannot pay millions to recover their data. It's very simple, right? So the mathematics is there based on the revenue of the company and the capability of the company to pay that amount, right? So if they attack a small business, like a bakery, they cannot get millions out of a small bakery, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, true. I kind of understand where you're coming from. So, Peter, I have a few more questions for you. What's
Sure.
the most important thing people should understand about ransomware negotiations, in your opinion?
The basic things, the things you need to understand is that you might not result in a successful restoration activity, right? Which means that if a threat actor has encrypted your data and the decryption key does not work, you have to go back to the threat actor, and maybe by this time they've deleted the instance through which you were communicating, right? So there is no way of you communicating back with the threat actor. So this is one. So what I want to say is that negotiations may not result in a positive outcome for you as a company, right?
Yeah.
It might just be a delay tactic if the operator's goal is to just disrupt you, steal your money. That's what's going to happen, right? They might not give you the correct recovery key. The second aspect is that there is a possibility that the threat actor has left a backdoor in your system, and then they can come back, re-encrypt, and demand more value, right? More money from you. So another thing that you need to watch out for is once you start recovering systems, that you are actually hardening the environment, right? So when you do start the recovery process of an organization from a ransomware attack, you need to basically close all doors that were there in your organization, how the threat actor walked in, right? So there are a couple of things happening in parallel during your negotiations, right? Or they should be happening. Is one is to establish patient zero, or the initial access of the threat actor. So how did they get in? So once you understand how they got in, now you start looking, what did they do in your environment? So you want to be sure that they cannot come back once you recover. Because there are threat actors that basically encrypt your environment, you pay the ransom, you may get your key back, right? You start decrypting your environment, but then a couple of weeks later, another ransomware operator hits you just because you didn't close the door or you didn't find the back door that was left there by the threat actor.
And who's to blame for such situations? Like when a ransom attack happens, what does it depend on? Who do you blame when such a situation happens in a company?
But why do you have to blame, right? So the fact is there. The goal of a ransomware negotiator, right, or an incident response company is not to blame. It is actually to establish facts, right? So you're not blaming, individuals or an organization. The incident happened. You cannot blame anybody at this stage. You're not a investigator to say this is the person to blame. Your goal is to find the facts. The facts are somebody got in. How did they get in? That's a result of many different things, right? So,
most ransom operators are not really advanced technically. So they mainly depend sometimes on phishing attacks. And would you say it's the employee's fault then because he opened the specific file or whatsoever?
Again, I will not blame anybody. You're there to establish the facts, right? So the fact is somebody clicked on an email, somebody landed on your machine, did lateral movement. So you cannot just say, just because this person clicked, we got compromised and they ransomware. Again, it's a systematic failure of the organization. You have failed to protect your organization. Simple as that.
Right?
Because if somebody landed on your computer, right, and then the malware got the activity is not detected or prevented, you have multiple failures, right? Or somebody did not respond on time. So again, you have multiple things that can fail in an instance. So pinpointing or blaming is not the game. It's basically establishing the facts and then basically doing a proper remediation and hardening of the organization, right? Sorry to answer you like this, but there is no blame game when you
No,
are
it's
on the
okay.
citrus on that.
But this brings a question to me actually.
Sure.
Doesn't this open a door? Like, what if there's hypothetically, but this sort of opens a door for an employee to maybe, I mean, if this is the case and no one gets blamed or takes responsibility, maybe one employee talks to some ransom group and they make a deal. You get into my system. I will click this, do this, and then we can share whatever the company I work in pays you. Don't you think that could, not be very practical?
So we are starting with discovering facts about about how the ransomware got in. So the initial access would be an insider threat. So that means that the ransomware operator paid your employee to provide access, right? So this is not a blame game again. It is basically a malicious insider that you now have proof and you can actually take to court and so on and so forth and take legal action against. So this is, again, not a blame game.
Interesting perspective. Peter, I think you covered a lot in terms of showing how negotiation actually works. So thank you for that. You gave good advice, to be honest. I've never seen it from that perspective. So it's good to see that when you stand your ground, things actually move your way. And facts are very important. So I'm glad you pointed out that there is no blame game here. If something is unsecure, it's just unsecure, and that's the major fact of it. The company failed to protect its own data, and that's all there is to it. No one should be blamed for such thing because such things take place all the time. We should have the right security measures put in place to avoid such unwanted incidents. So thank you.
It boils down, definitely, it boils down to right measures and preparedness of an organization, right? I just want to highlight one thing, right? Usually, when mature organizations do test their security controls, right? So this is either done to pen testing engagements, red teaming engagements, adversary simulations, so on and so forth, right? So the moment you engage on this level, you should have an output from your red team or from the contractor that's providing you that data. Effectively, you will have a number of vulnerabilities, misconfigurations that should go effectively in an organization's risk register. Somebody has to accept that risk, right?
Yes.
But again, what I'm trying to say, or mitigate the risk. So you develop controls based on, is it worth for my organization to implement this control to mitigate this risk? Is the control more expensive than actually me getting hit by a ransomware attack, as an example, right? So all of these factors are factored in the risk register, and this is basically communicated to internally. And at least this is for mature organizations, right?
Yes.
On the other hand, smaller organizations do not do this, right? Like, as I said, like a small bakery that gets hit or whatever.
Yeah, true. Maturity level always counts, and it plays a big part in decision making as well. So of course this matters. So Peter, just one last question for you before we actually wrap up. Is there anyone you'd like to see join the Cyber Pulse in a future episode?
Well, I do wish that communities like this in Qatar, do more, like more webcasts or more meetings or podcasts or whatever, simply just to do knowledge sharing and basically people to know each other, So this is something what I would basically recommend, and I would like to see more in your podcast or in the country itself, definitely.
This episode was actually more fun than my lectures. It was very interesting, but I'm really sad that it ended this quickly. Maybe in the future we could have another one.
Inshallah.
Sure, no worries.
Peter, if you're open to it, we'll catch you in another episode, hopefully, because I think this episode is gonna create a lot of interest, to be honest. You shared really good inputs, and I've learned a lot from you. I think Hadi learned a lot from you as well. So thank you for
definitely.
this. This episode shows that ransomware negotiations are rarely simple. They're not about winning or losing, they're about reducing harm, managing risk, and making decisions with limited information under extreme pressure. What happens in these moments doesn't just affect systems, it affects people, trust, and long term resilience. Thank you for listening to the Cyber Pulse podcast. See you in the next episode.